Absolutely.
Has anybody able to get out today and play?
Well, I didn't say I didn't play anything, but I did get out.
Hmm. Good, good.
Yeah.
Margaret, are you free to talk about what I'm asked you about? The adventures of your husband? The National Journal after so maybe November. And please, Robert, you correct me in a minute here. And then he's also going to do some presentation on Saturday morning to kind of set the venue and stuff of what we're doing Saturday with the or I'm sorry, Friday for the Chautauqua. Uh, and um, and I said, well, do you have some other stuff that you could talk about that maybe you won't get a chance to talk about on Friday morning? And he graciously said yes. So this is not double duty of stuff he's going to do in the fall, but it may be some stuff you're going to see in the article. And Robert Bowling, we are so grateful for you, our expert. So thank you, sir. Take it away, Liz. Set us up on speaker, and we'll go from there.
So in the top right corner of your windows there, you should see a little icon that says view. Choose the speaker view, and that will put the speaker on large. So okay, you're ready, Robert.
All right. Well, first of all, good evening. I will try not to bore you guys, um, but I know that this is being recorded. So for a lot of the members that may be watching later, obviously we have the annual meeting, and as Dave said, we will have a trolley tour, and a lot of those. The presentation I will give in October will cover a lot of those stops that you're going to see on the tour. So tonight, I wanted to really focus on some other areas that I will not be really talking about in October, and that but you may see in the article. And I was really excited when we found out that the annual meeting was coming to Indianapolis or coming to Indiana, and I'm very curious. I love research, so I decided I want to know how often did Theodore Roosevelt come to Indiana. What was his connection? We obviously know Charles Fairbanks, but uh, just how many times did he come to Indiana, and what did he do while he was here? So he visited Indiana officially 9 separate times, and what I'm going to talk about tonight are the first time he visited Indiana, as well as the last time that he visited Indiana. And I know I've got about 30 minutes to speak. Hopefully, it takes that long. I think those two events should take that amount of time. And obviously, the ones that are in attendance, if you guys got questions, feel free to ask as I'm talking. And also, that would probably help any viewers that will be watching later. So the first visit that TR made to Indiana was in 1900, and he was Governor Roosevelt at the time. He had just received the Republican nomination for vice president at the Republican National Convention in Philadelphia. And Roosevelt was picked to do the last campaign push right before Election Day. And for some reason, Indiana and Kentucky were one of the two of the last stops on this campaign tour. And Roosevelt's tour through Indiana would take 3 days. It would cover 26 different cities, and he would appear in 10 of the 13 congressional districts. So Indiana, for I don't know, for whatever reason, Indiana was on the map. So Roosevelt left Chicago on Wednesday morning, October 10th. That's when his tour began. And the first stop or the final destination of day one was Fort Wayne. So in Chicago, Roosevelt had an entourage of people that were coming to travel with him. We had the governor, Governor Mount, uh, Senator Charles Fairbanks was with him. He had 4 congressmen, he had 8 reporters, he had the National Republican Committee chairman. So lots and lots of people traveling with him. He was on his private train car, which I came across. It was actually called the Minnesota. And his first stop in Indiana was Hammond. This was a very important manufacturing city in Indiana. The day was treated like a holiday. Hotels were booked. Um, Everybody had the day off, and over 15,000 people turned out to hear Roosevelt speak. Now, almost every stop, he only spoke for about 15 minutes. He didn't speak longer than that. And obviously, that's because of the brevity. I mean, he isn't making a lot of stops. You really can't give long presentation or long speeches. So he stopped in Hammond, um, and then from Hammond, he made two unscheduled stops. And he made one in Rensselaer, and he made one in Monon. And one of the things I find interesting, real quick, is when I was researching this, I came across a lot of cities I never heard of before. And I'm gonna some of these cities you may have heard of. Some of these cities I had to look up. Some of them are not even cities anymore. So I thought it was really interesting. And back then, you could really track a president's travels because, like nowadays, they don't post the president's itinerary. You don't really know where the president's going, obviously for safety reasons. But back then, it's very simple. I mean, they would broadcast where Roosevelt was going to be at any given day and what time. So it was very easy to kind of track his movements. But he made two stops, Rensselaer and Monon. And while he was there, Roosevelt, I think his strategy was to try to recruit Democrats to come over to the Republican side. So a couple of people in his train were lifelong Democrats who rejected William Jennings Bryan, and that's who they were going against. This was a rematch. This is who they were going against in 1900, and these two men on his train, they referred to themselves as Americans first, party men second. So they said that they rejected Bryan, and they said they wanted to vote for McKinley. So his train arrived next in Lafayette, and I mean we're talking 20,000 people. There was cannon burst. There was a huge parade set up for him. So the speech consisted of, or he spoke to at least 1,000 Rough Riders. Bands from all over Tippecanoe County were there, and students from Purdue University were also in attendance. So although they were in Lafayette for about an hour and a half, he still only spoke for about 15 minutes. But his speech was filled with humor, and he was really trying to recruit people over to the Republican Party. So from Lafayette, the train made brief stops in Frankfort, Logansport, Peru, Wabash, and Huntington. And finally, the final destination was Fort Wayne. He arrived in Fort Wayne about 7:30 p.m. By this time, it was very dark, but they had a huge parade. There was fireworks. I mean, rockets shooting up in the sky. And the parade that greeted him in Fort Wayne was about a mile long. There were the highlight of the parade was a whole bunch of Rough Riders that had come out to greet Roosevelt, and then Roosevelt was scheduled to speak at a place called the Prince's Rink. I looked it up. I can't find anything more about it, but it was a popular amusement venue in Fort Wayne. And while he was there, his speech focused on what Bryan was doing in Illinois. So William Jennings Bryan, was in Macomb, Illinois at the same time. And Bryan was leveling false accusations against Roosevelt and the Republican Party. He was saying that the Republican Party wanted to expand the military by using forts near major cities to intimidate the labor unions. And Roosevelt categorically denied this. Roosevelt believed that the army needed to be increased because of the war in the Philippines. But what Bryan was trying to do was trying to confuse the voters by saying that Roosevelt was using the military to basically intimidate labor unions, and that wasn't the case. So Roosevelt took issue with that. So the entire time he was talking, he basically wanted to set the record straight that that is not what they were intending to do. So many people churned out to hear Roosevelt speak that there was not enough room at the Prince's Rink. So there was two overflow locations, and once again, Roosevelt spoke at both of them. He once again trying to get people to come over to the Republican Party. And he was telling Democrats, you can take a leap of faith, join the Republicans, is what he was trying to say. And so he's, after his speaking at 3 different locations in Fort Wayne, which was not, he did not intend to, he's only intending to speak at one. The night got over about 11 p.m. But there was some drama in Fort Wayne. So Fort Wayne is a very heavily Democratic city. I think it still is, and it was back then. And so while Theodore Roosevelt was in his carriage heading over to the Prince's Rink, some people threw stones at his carriage. One of those stones hit Theodore Roosevelt in the side. It bounced off of him and hit Colonel Guild, who was in his carriage, hit him in the mouth, busted his lip open. And this is true Roosevelt fashion. He was like, it's not that big of a deal, right? But Governor Mount and Senator Fairbanks, they were like in shock. Their mouths dropped open. I mean, I could just imagine. They just apologized profusely on behalf of the state of Indiana that we are so sorry that this happened. And I think Roosevelt just realized, hey, you know what? It's politics. They're Democrats. They don't like me. So, and that's just the way he is. So after his night was over, he finally got back to his train car, and he finally got to bed probably about 1 a.m., ready for a very early morning the next day. He was back up at 7. And the day began in Marion, Indiana. Day 2 started in Marion, where he spoke to a crowd of about 25,000 people. And then from there, he went to Fairmount, Summitville, which was an unscheduled stop, and then Alexandria. And while he was in Alexandria, once again, Roosevelt took any opportunity that he could to make up ground where Bryan would basically faltered. And when Bryan was in, the same route, the same stops that Roosevelt made were almost identical to the same ones that William Jennings Bryan made a month earlier. So when Bryan was in Alexandria a month before, he said that if he was elected, he would put a complete stop to corporations by putting their goods on the free list. Well, Roosevelt appealed to the people and said that the Republican Party was opposed to this. Alexandria was a big glass-making city, and he told the people that the Republican Party would not destroy corporations, but rather protect the American labor force against the competition against its foreign rivals. So once again, Roosevelt found an opening, and he took it. After Alexandria, he stopped in Anderson. A unique characteristic of this crowd was that the number of first-time voters whose fathers had been lifelong Democrats. And Adams Township in Madison County was heavily Democratic, and one of the most prominent farmers in that area had rejected Bryan in favor of McKinley. So his conversion was instrumental in a lot of Democrats defecting for the Republicans. So once again, I think that was his campaign strategy, was to get all those Democratic voters. After that, he stopped in Muncie, 30,000 people there. His next stop was Winchester, Indiana. And then he made it to Richmond about 1:45 that afternoon. As you can see how many stops he's making. It's a busy day. And this is all by train. And then he made unscheduled stops in Cambridge City, Knightstown, and Greenfield en route to his final destination of day 2, which was Indianapolis. So one thing I want to point out here is most of the people on his train, when they left for Indianapolis, most of the people on his train had already been with him since they left Chicago. But he added one new person to his train, and that was a guy named Gurley Brewer, who was an African American. He was most notable for being the editor of the Indianapolis World, which was the first African American newspaper, one of the first in Indiana. He was also the first African American admitted to the bar in Southern Indiana, and he was a very staunch reporter of the Republican Party. He campaigned for Benjamin Harrison in 1888. So it was very unique for an African American, especially during that time period, to be on his train. So I think that kind of shows how Theodore Roosevelt was very progressive, even at that point in time. He something that was kind of looked down upon. Roosevelt was like, no, come on board. And I think that was when I came across that, I thought it was a very unique story. It got me to actually research Gurley Brewer and find a little bit more about him. All right, so now we're here in Indianapolis. This is obviously the big city. This was an immense parade. So when he arrived in Indianapolis, there was more than 100,000 people that had turned out to see Theodore Roosevelt. Special trains were coming from Noblesville, Tipton, Shelbyville, Connorsville, Rushville, Martinsville. The Rushville special train needed 32 cars to added to it in order to accommodate all the people that wanted to get to Indianapolis to see Roosevelt. But once again, Democrats have to spoil it. Democrats accused the Republicans of using the Indiana State Fair, which was going on at the same time, for inflating their numbers. They're saying, oh, wait a minute. Roosevelt didn't bring out 100,000 people. The state fair was in town too, so that's the reason why. And we see this today, right? When politicians like, I had more people at my event than you had at yours. The same way back in 1900. So I thought I had to smirk and laugh a little bit at that one. But Roosevelt was treated to a parade in Indianapolis. And let me tell you, this parade was immense. Nothing like it had ever been seen in Indianapolis since James Blaine visited Indiana on his presidential election in 1884. Conservative estimates of the parade size was 25,000 people, divided into 12 divisions, each under the command of a parade marshal. So just to give you an idea how big this parade is, it said it was so large that it took 4 hours for it to pass a given point. That's how long the parade lasted. So, I mean, we're talking massive. And so Roosevelt once again gave a speech, and that pretty much ended his day in Indianapolis. The final day of the campaign, day 3, started in Plainfield, which was a very big Quaker community. And he spoke to the people there about how the Quakers had supported McKinley, and they were wanting their support again. And then from there, he made stops in Greencastle, and I always say Brazil, but is it Brazil? I think it's Brazil. And then they stopped off in Terre Haute. So Terre Haute obviously is another big Democratic city. And once again, I think that's what he was aiming for, is to try to get all those Democratic voters. He was met by like 25,000 people in Terre Haute. He was supposed to speak at the Republican Tabernacle, and it was considered the most significant Republican event that's ever been held in that county. And I think Roosevelt took pride in the fact that his crowd was twice as big as the one that turned out to see Bryan speak the month before. He also then made an unscheduled stop in Lewis, Indiana. I had to look this city up because I'd never heard of Lewis. But the only reason why he stopped there is because they had erected a platform for William Jennings Bryan to speak. But the day that Bryan was there, it was raining, so he didn't speak from the platform. Instead, he spoke from his car. That slighted the Democrats. And so the Democrats actually reached out to Roosevelt and said, would you be willing to speak? And he said, yes, I would. So Lewis was not on the scheduled itinerary. He made an unscheduled stop, once again, taking advantage of all those times that Bryan just alienated voters. I don't think Lewis was really like, we're not going to win the election based on that. But once again, it showed that Roosevelt was willing to reach out to Republicans and Democrats. From Lewis, he made stops in Linton. All right, here's a city I've never heard of before. Bee Hunter. I looked it up. It's no longer a town. It's an unincorporated community. But he stopped in Bee Hunter, Vincennes. He stopped in the towns of Marco, Sanborn, Edwardsport, Bicknell, and then he made a final stop in Princeton before arriving at their final destination that day, which was Evansville. Evansville was actually supposed to be the highlight of the entire campaign. More than in Indianapolis, Evansville was supposed to be the grand finale. However, it was not. The parade could have been a lot better. There were like 1,800 people in the parade, nothing like the 25,000 in Indianapolis. It took less than 30 minutes to pass. There was not that many decorations. And the most unique characteristic about this entire parade was that African Americans made up about 20% of the parade, but yet they represented less than half of the eligible voters present. So, um, so yeah, I think Evansville is kind of a letdown because they didn't go all out like a lot of the other cities did. But anyway, Roosevelt, once again, he used this opportunity to speak about the Army and what was going on in the Philippines. Once again, Bryan was trying to confuse voters about Roosevelt increasing the size of the Army. And then Roosevelt mentioned that, wait a minute, the senator who introduced the bill to increase the Army is actually from your party. So how can you accuse the Republicans of trying to do this when your own party is trying to do it? And then Roosevelt turned the tables on Bryan. Roosevelt then asked Bryan 3 questions because it seemed like he was being accused of stuff on the campaign trail. Roosevelt then asked him 3 things. If he's elected, will he pay the national debt in silver or gold? And Bryan believed in free silver, so he wanted to take us off the gold standard. The second question was that was he willing to refuse to accept the electoral votes of North Carolina? So back in 1898, the white Democrats overthrew the Republican government, which led to a restructuring of politics and the disenfranchisement of black voters. And then the last question was, would he denounce his party in Congress that voted on June 1st that the federal government should not be given the power to control trusts? So now we have a war between Roosevelt and Bryan. He also attacked Bryan by claiming that he cared more for a band of outlaws, referring to the insurrectionists in the Philippines, than he did for the black men of South Carolina. Roosevelt told the crowd that he didn't ask for special privileges for any man, but for equitable treatment for all. In his opinion, he said the Democratic Party stands for mob violence at home and shrinking from our duty abroad. He further said, when they array class against class, race against race, they deserve the contempt of the American people. The motto of the Democratic Party is some men down. Our motto is all men up. So he gave a speech at the Great Opera House, and that concluded basically his last speech of the campaign tour was at the Opera House. And when it was all over with, a delegation from Henderson, Kentucky met him that would take him to Kentucky, and the election was only a few weeks away. At the conclusion of this tour, he had been on the road for 32 straight days, traveled 12,614 miles, visited 14 states, and gave 288 speeches. Roosevelt was exhausted at times, but the end was almost near. And, well, we all know what happened. McKinley and Roosevelt won the election. They also increased the electoral votes in Indiana from 1896, and they also increased their electoral votes nationwide. So obviously all the good things that Roosevelt did, spending all that time here in Indiana, those 3 days, really helped out. And the one thing I haven't done is look to see, Democratic numbers, how much he was able to swing, but obviously he swung a lot of Democratic votes to the Republican side in order to win that election. So, but that was basically the 1900 visit. Any questions you guys got about before I move to 1918? Good. All right. All right. So let's move to the last time that he visited Indiana, and this would be 1918. Obviously, no longer president. Roosevelt came back to Indiana. At this time, 1918, the United States is embroiled in World War I. The war had started back in 1914. And Roosevelt's visit to Indiana was sponsored by the National Security League. So, I'll give you a little bit of background about the National Security League. When the war started in 1914, Roosevelt, along with a bunch of other people, believed that Woodrow Wilson did not do a good enough job of getting us prepared for the war. And we all know that Theodore Roosevelt was always about military preparedness. One of the things he did as president was he sent the Great White Fleet around the world not only to show American superiority, naval superiority, but to show that we're ready. Don't come messing with us. So because of our not being prepared for World War I, they created the National Security League, and they were primarily concerned originally with military preparedness. But after the U.S. entered the war in 1917, its focus began to change, and they started to pursue what they called 100% Americanism. They wanted Americans to be more patriotic. They wanted people to go fight. They encouraged physical training in schools so that they were in physical shape when being called up for military service. And Roosevelt advocated for a universal military service. He believed that everybody should be drafted, and all men were required to serve in the military. So under the NSL, they sent Roosevelt on a Midwest tour that included Omaha, Nebraska, St. Louis, Missouri, and Indianapolis, Indiana. And when he got to, after he got done speaking in Omaha, on his way to St. Louis, something happened. They had to unscheduled stop in St. Joseph, Missouri, because Roosevelt got a fever. And they just assumed that it was from his time in the Amazon on the River of Doubt. And that's all they thought it was. But they brought a doctor on board. The doctor said that Theodore Roosevelt had a bacterial infection of the upper dermis on his leg. The only thing I can think of was back in 1902, he had to have emergency surgery in Indianapolis, which I will talk further in October. That could have been a result of that. I don't know. But we know that Theodore Roosevelt was he was an avid outdoorsman, so very physically active. But that could be one explanation as to why he had that injury. Anyway, Roosevelt was not about to stop speaking. The doctor said, "You need a rest." He goes, "Nope." So they brought the doctor on board the train from St. Joseph, Missouri, and the doctor had to go along with Roosevelt on the rest of his tour. So, I mean, I guess that's how much pull you got when you're the president. You're like, you're coming on board with me. I need a doctor. So anyway, they finally get to Indiana. The first stop was in Terre Haute, where they picked up Mayor Jewett, who was the mayor of Indianapolis. And then in Greencastle, they picked up the governor, Goodrich. And then they went to Indianapolis. So in Indianapolis, Roosevelt was scheduled to speak at the Coliseum at the Indiana State Fairgrounds. And he used Indianapolis as the basis to begin his war stamp campaign. It's almost like war bonds. He wanted to finance the war. He's trying to encourage people to buy war stamps to start funding help finance the war. And so he chose Indianapolis as the beginning for this. So while he was here, he gave a few speeches, and he wasn't scheduled to speak until that night. And obviously, his doctors urged him, "Will you just go home or go to the hotel and rest? Don't do anything." But one adjective that I can give Roosevelt is that he's stubborn. And even though the doctor said, "Do not do anything, just go home, just go back to your room and rest," he didn't. He took a lot of meetings. And anyway, he left his hotel. They took him over to the Coliseum. And when he got over to the Coliseum, it was packed out. I mean, there was standing room. Some people couldn't even get in. They had to stand outside the Coliseum and see if they could hear. But when he got up to the podium to speak, Charles Fairbanks had just died the month before. And he started his speech with paying respects to Charles Fairbanks. And after the presidency, the relationship between Charles Fairbanks and Roosevelt, it soured. Obviously, Charles Fairbanks felt like he should have been the next president. Instead, Roosevelt chose Taft as his successor. And obviously that caused some I guess, some tension between the Fairbanks and the Roosevelts. But Roosevelt told the crowd that in the final, I guess, weeks of his life, Fairbanks wrote him 2 letters, and he wanted to express his sympathy to Roosevelt for the stand that he was taking on important issues like Americanism. And Roosevelt said in describing Fairbanks, "No man ever had a more considerate and loyal associate in public life than Mr. Fairbanks was to me." So I think that made a lot of people happy that Roosevelt took time out of his speech to recognize Fairbanks. But then it was time to get back on point. He started to talk about why he was there. And before he could do that, everybody was chanting Teddy 1920. And Roosevelt stopped him right there and said, "This is not a political rally. I am not a candidate for office in 1920. And politics is only going to cloud my message. So I am here to urge you to support the War Stamp campaign, but I am not going to be a candidate for office in 1920. So in his speech, Roosevelt addressed what Americanism is, because I've said that word a few times already, but exactly what is Americanism? Well, Roosevelt laid it out in his speech exactly what Americanism is. He said, Americanism is 100% pure, and there is no place in this country for 50-50 loyalty. He seemed to be going off script. He gave a stinging rebuke to pacifists and conscientious objectors who tried to avoid military service. We know that Roosevelt he believed in the military wholeheartedly. I don't know if you know this, but there was a book I read. The only time that Roosevelt was ashamed of his father is when he found out that his father paid someone to fight for him in the Civil War. And I believe that, that hurt Roosevelt, because he was somebody that you didn't shirk from military duty. So even in his speech, he had disdain for people that tried to get out of military service. He expresses disdain for posters with slogans like "Food will win the war." He said the only thing that will win the war is men in uniform and nothing else. Roosevelt defined Americanism as, Roosevelt tried to say that 4 years earlier, people may have been able to love 2 countries equally, but that time has passed. He preached against organizations at that time, such as the National German Alliance. His slogan was "One country, one flag, one language." He insisted that only English should be taught in schools, and those who don't agree can leave. Indiana, sadly enough, banned the teaching of German in schools in 1919, and it was not reinstated until sometime in the 1970s. He also said the country needed to ban newspapers that were printed in foreign languages. And he said, although his speech sounded xenophobic, he stressed to the crowd that foreign-born citizens who are loyal to the country should be treated the same as American-born citizens. He said for Roosevelt, total loyalty could only be to one country. And that's, to him, that's what Americanism was, and that's what he was going around the country preaching. So that speech lasted nearly an hour, and apparently they reached their goal. The goal was to raise $5 million in Marion County from the War Stamps campaign, and they actually raised $6.5 million. And the next morning, Roosevelt and the Goodriches, Governor Goodrich and his wife, they left by car to attend the commencement ceremony at Indiana University. I have to give a shout out to Margaret. She's the one who first told me about this. So then I had to look that up. The class of 1918 consisted of 236 graduates. It was one of the smallest classes in Indiana history. That's mainly because most of the students had withdrew from the school in order to go fight in the war. His speech to the graduating class was similar to the one that he gave at the Coliseum. He told the students that they need to be in service to their country and prepare for a higher and better life. He ended with this quote: "If there's anything I dislike more than a German militarist, it is an American pacifist. I shoot wild beasts, but step on a snake." So after the commencement, Roosevelt returned to Indianapolis to catch the train back to Oyster Bay. He was still greeted with hoorays for Teddy and Teddy in 1920 on his way back. And when he got back to Oyster Bay, that was his last trip to Indiana because a few months later, Roosevelt died on January 6th, 1919. So, and that is my presentation on his first and last visits to our great state of Indiana.
But Bob, I have a question. Maybe you can answer, or the other scholars here. So when Roosevelt was doing his whistle stop tour there in 1900, did he tend to do the same kind of speech, his 15 minutes? He had a routine he did, or did he really vary from that?
Yeah, no, he varied, and some of that stuff I didn't go into full detail. I just kind of skimmed over, but some of these stops I kind of discussed some of the things he would talk about, and he always changed it up a little bit. It wasn't always this is the same speech I'm going to give at this stop or this stop and this stop. He mixed it up a little bit. Sometimes it had the same message, but he would switch things up. Like when he stopped in Lafayette, by what I read, his speech was more humorous. Like he wasn't really going after Bryan at this time. I think he was making some lighthearted humor with the crowd and just trying to get everybody kind of relaxed. But just to give you an idea, like, so he visited in 1900. He visited us in 1902 as president, which I will be going into some detail about that in October. He visited in 1903, 1905, 1907, and then after his presidency, he came back in 1910, 1912, 1914, and 1918.
Oh, hey, so you probably got a feeling, was Indiana a strong Democrat or 50-50 statewide then?
That's a good question. I don't know. Obviously, Indiana went Republican, but that election. But I think it was. I'm guessing it's probably the same way it is kind of now. Like your major population centers are usually more Democratic, and the more rural areas are Republican. And I don't think there's I mean, I'd have to look at it. Don't quote me on it. I would say that's probably the same way it was there. I know that in the South, that's a lot different. In the South back then, the South was mostly all Democratic. The North was mostly Republican. And then probably since the Civil Rights era, we flip flop. Now the South is heavily Republican and the North is heavily Democrat.
You can't, down by the river, you can't get elected if you're a Republican. And in Johnson County, it's hard to get reelected or elected if you're a Democrat. So, I mean, there's still some, balance and variety. And that's why Indiana gets some attention with vice presidents and things like that. What other questions you guys got? What a good presentation, man. I'm just overwhelmed. This is I never knew he went through Muncie and Winchester and Alexandria. That's my hometown. It's
like
Brazil, not
Brazil.
Brazil.
All right. Yeah, because I said Brazil. Like, there's been some times I've said like, all right, so Lebanon, and
Well,
people say Lebanon, and they're like, no, that's the country. We pronounce it Lebanon. So I was like, okay. So I want to make sure it's like, is it Brazil or Brazil, or is it, is there a different pronunciation of it? So
I've never heard of bee hunter though. That's
Yeah,
a
I didn't
totally new
either.
one to me.
And when you look it up on Wikipedia, it says an unincorporated community, but apparently it was back then big enough to make a train stop.
yeah, it was important.
I mean, there's still some cities that like Summitville.
Yeah.
Where's
Bicknell? Bicknell's little. We did SAT testing last week in Bicknell.
Oh, really?
Tiny.
So we got. I've heard of Edwardsport, but like Sanborn,
No.
and Marco, never I don't know any of those stops, but those are down south. That's when he was heading to Evansville, so he's stopping in like Vincennes and Princeton and things like that.
But it's amazing the trains would go there, and he chose to go there and follow the train tracks and made a presentation there. Hey,
Yeah.
what else you got? Anybody else got some questions? The hour's getting late.
Elizabeth's got a question about why did the Terre Haute mayor go with TR?
No. I'm sorry. Yeah, no. It was not Terre Haute mayor. Mayor Jewett was mayor of Indianapolis, and I thought I had said that, but no. So
Oh,
he so a lot of times what happens is that delegate or people like VIPs, they will meet the train so that they can arrive all together in Indianapolis. So the mayor of Indianapolis came to Terre Haute to meet Roosevelt on the train. Then they picked up the governor in Greencastle, and that way, when they get to Indianapolis, they've all arrived together on the same train. So instead of them already being in Indianapolis and Roosevelt arriving by himself, that's usually what happened. So like when they left Chicago in 1900, all those people went to Chicago, the Indiana delegation, to meet the president. And then like at the end of his tour, when he was in Evansville, the delegation from Henderson, Kentucky, came to Evansville so that they can all arrive in the city together.
I see. And are you an academic, or do you just do this for fun in your spare time?
Yeah, I'm just a big nerd. And yeah, I just do this for fun. I love to write history. I love to research. I am like newspapers.com. It's like my rabbit hole. And I just start writing, and like I just wrote another article for the TR Journal. It was about TR's 1900 tour through New England, all to his New England states. So yeah.
And you said he visited Indiana in 1901 also?
No, 1900 and 1902. So as president, the first time he came back was in 1902.
This is
Okay.
Rich Reiner. Did you come across anything much about James Whitcomb Riley and TR and their involvement together?
I had something written about Wickham Riley. There was an event where they spoke.
Well,
I think they spoke at-
1907.
I think it was like, yes,
1907.
that's what
Lawton.
when they were, I think, commissioning the Lawton statue.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I
And-
think
Yeah,
and I think-
because
And I think
Riley-
was at Fairbanks home when he was hosting a party.
Yeah.
And I'll be talking about those in detail in October.
and I think Riley wrote a poem. I don't know if it was the dedication for the Lawton statue or for
Yes.
the Monument Circle statue.
No, it was for Lawton.
For
You're
Lawton.
Lawton, it's a long poem, very long.
Yeah. What was the actual name of let's see if I can find the name of that poem, because I got the name of it.
It's kind of pretty, parts of it, but it is long. It is. Yeah.
It's
And
called
also-
Home Voyage.
I'm sorry?
Yeah.
Home Voyage.
Home Voyage. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah. Also that in the first meeting of the Indiana Society of Chicago, and I forgot what year that was, that Riley apparently he was one of the founding members, but he couldn't attend that meeting because he was at the White House having dinner with TR.
Okay.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. And there's a picture of him, in his top hat at the White House.
Ah, that's interesting.
Mhm.
Rich has so many connections with Riley and stuff. He knows stuff. Hey, I will mention that he left here June 10th, I think, in 1918 when he was in Indianapolis. July 18th, about 4 or 5 weeks later, is when Quentin died. His son, and boy, that part about the bacterial infection that kind of raises let's see, Rich, you're an MD, aren't you?
Yeah.
Doesn't that kind of raise some
But I haven't taken care of anyone over 10 pounds since 1973.
So they gave a name of it. I wasn't about to pronounce it. I got the actual name of what they diagnosed him with. Hold up. Since you got some medical training, let's see. Where's it at? He was diagnosed with. All right, I'll have to spell it. Erysipelas.
Erysipelas, which I think
Erysipelas.
was a strep infection, I think. Yeah, with the rash and all. Now, how they would have, I mean, I would guess they could have only diagnosed that clinically by the rash and the fever, because I doubt if, well, they wouldn't have been able to do any cultures or anything, I don't think. But did they describe his symptoms?
It just said that Dr. George Coleman, when they stopped in St. Joseph, Missouri, they just said he was diagnosed with and they just said it was a bacterial infection of the upper dermis on the left leg.
Yeah. Okay.
And then a few months earlier, Roosevelt had to be treated for abscesses in both ears.
Wow. And by treatment,
he's getting a lot older. I mean, he was kind of in bad health, but one thing about Roosevelt, I mean, if a gunshot wound to the chest wouldn't stop him from speaking, an abscess in his ears, or even a bacterial infection is not going to stop that guy.
Right.
So. Margaret, who's the fellow that's going to speak on Saturday of the event? And he's going to talk about the surgery in great detail. Do you remember his name?
Sir William.
Bill Dick?
Yes.
Yeah.
Bill Dick, yeah. He's a great talker. He gives great talks at the Scientific Club. I don't know if you ever were involved in that. The Scientific Club, which Lilly and who's the guy from Kokomo that invented the Haynes from Kokomo started about 105 years ago. They meet every Monday over the old Knights of Columbus meeting place on 71st Street, just west of Keystone. They give history talks, and Bill is very much involved in that and has given some great talks there. So he will give a great talk, I'm sure.
Yes, and he has some new research and thinking about the surgery that is not public yet, I understand. So look forward to that and hearing what he's got.
Okay, and finally, good stuff. We're gonna have so much fun in October, but this has been so good tonight. Anybody got any final questions? I can't pay this guy overtime, so
well, double zero is still zero.
Thanks, Rich.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Hey, will you all please express your appreciation to Robert and what a cool thing he's done for us, and send him an email or something